Alright everyone, it's time for Occult Literature, video number 342, Hebrew, Idolatry, and Superstition. Link in the description of my edition of this work on Amazon. Second and third links are to my books blogs. This will be going, I think, under the academic header because it is sort of a historical sketch. This is 51 pages, so this is more of a short scientific work, literally anthropological in backdrop. Now, the main purpose of this, despite the scientific side of it within history, is from a religious angle. That is, this is fundamentally a Christian work, and the idea is that around this time, there were forces within Christendom that were like, hey, the Jewish people, according to the Bible, especially in the OT, they're like worshiping the brazen graven images and the brazen bull and all this stuff and doing things that are unlawful. What got them the idea of doing this? They're like seeing God constantly. He's literally talking to them through these various people, and yet they still keep doing crazy pagan things. And did they make this idea themselves, or did it come from some other group that sort of corrupted them? The idea of this is an apologetic work to sort of defend the Old Testament Hebrew people against claims that they invented various forms of negligence and spiritual idolatry. And so it goes through and explains that no, historically, if you look at surrounding tribes, and there is one thing that is spoken of here that is very, very true, which is that it is more likely that a culture adopted and adapted a practice from another culture it interacted with than that it developed an idea on its own. It's much more easy to adapt an idea and appropriate it than it is to think it up for yourself. This is the case for technology, quirks within language, history, oral tradition, all of these things. In fact, if you look at the early wave of Judaism as it was actually written down beyond an oral tradition, it gets influenced by the Babylonians due to the captivity there. You know, the captivity that actually happened, unlike the one in Egypt, which never involved slavery. It involved voluntary servitude in exchange for grain surplus. By the way, this is what the Egyptians also did with their own population, because if you're a farmer, as 90% of them were, several months out of the year, there's nothing to do. So in order to get your food, you go to the granary and you get your rations, and then you labor on the pyramids or do something else. You do something productive in the off-season, and you get an extra share of the food above and beyond what you had as a farmer. It's very centralized. This is how they built the pyramids. Anyway, ideas like... this discusses quite a few of them. Ideas like the Asherah, sacred grove, the totem, the wooden pole, or even the use of a rod, like a scepter, is basically just a degenerated, more simplistic version of the wooden totem, which in turn is sort of can be a degeneration of the sacred grove, which of course requires certain location and or maintenance, and of course then the various other tribes come and destroy your Asherah, and it becomes a big problem, and then you have to plant a new one, and it takes a while. What happens here is that for the most part, the various idolatrous practices that are condemned in part or in whole, witchcraft, divination and stuff, in the Bible, the explanation given is, well, the Hebrew people were interacting with the Hittites, the Moabites, the Amorites, the Phoenicians, all of these other groups, and adopted practices from them that would have been in vogue, especially when they moved into an area where they weren't the dominant party. When they were dominant, the other tribe was wiped out or appropriated in some way. It was subsumed, or its own practices changed. When the Hebrews were subsumed, like by the Babylonians, they began adopting elements of those practices. And so where you see a behavioral disconnect, especially culturally, and this is true, between what is done in a religious group, not necessarily just Judaism, but literally any religion. We see this profusely with Christianity. A lot of the practices of Romanism are not authentically Christian. They come from the Roman Empire, ergo they come from paganism. The practices, the holiday dates, certain elements of ritual, even the garb that the Pope wears is literally an adaptation of like the Babylonian fish hat. This is not a joke. It's the same mitre that the Babylonian priest wore, worshipping the sea and shit like that. It's the same fucking shit. It's a simplified version of the fishtail. Jesus, of course, the great fisherman of souls, and all of these other convolutions. What happened is that those practices were simply incorporated. And then when Christianity became the big kahuna, of course, number one, they start to deappropriate some of those practices because they understood them to be sinful, like, the whole The drinking blood literally thing wasn't very common in the early church. And then they began causing the surrounding pagan groups to adopt Christianity. Those pagan groups kept elements of their own customs. We see this today with various saintly festivals and things of that nature within Catholicism. We certainly see it in the Americanism of the Protestant movement. What happens, therefore, is that this explains, no, don't worry, yes, they were being idolatrous, but they got the idea from the Hittites. They got it from the Moabites. In most cases, I agree. I would say that's true. However, of course, that would also argue the very stretched out edge of this argument would be that the Hebraic people never developed their own rituals at all. They never were the origin of any of these rituals, of any of these practices. There are some, though, that are spoken of here where the origin's not quite clear, and so the author posits a pre-existing primordial sort of racial group that informs all the other tribes, including the Hebrews, the people of the Palestinian region, the Levant in general, as opposed to saying, well, maybe they actually did invent one of these abiblical forms of idolatry, which is very, very funny. Again, linked in the description of my edition of this work on Amazon, second and third links to my books, blogs. It is highly recommended. It's very scientific and historical. It's also quite dense, but I found it to be a very enjoyable work. That's about all. Peace out.